Hello and welcome to the radiotimes.com Doctor Who podcast. I'm Huw Fullerton.
I'm Morgan Jeffrey.
And this week, in which Morgan may have given the game away a little bit, we're talking about the bane of canon, that is the Morbius Doctors, the Doctor's possible extra lives as revealed in the 1976 serial, The Brain of Morbius. Basically, this came up in our sort of series 12 Doctor Who podcast reviews, but we didn't talk about it specifically, and we thought we'd kind of take the opportunity to kick around the idea a little bit. But I don't know, Morgan, if you want to kind of give us some background, some facts about where the Morbius Doctors arrived and where they kind of fit in.
Sure. So, I'll do my best. So, as you mentioned, this idea of the so-called Morbius Doctors was established in the 1976 story, The Brain of Morbius. And in that story, in the climax, the Doctor faces off against the Time Lord war criminal Morbius in a mind-bending battle, as you do. And Morbius is winning the battle, and he says to the Doctor, back to your beginning. And we see the face of the then current Dr. Tom Baker flash up on a screen, followed by the third Dr. John Pertwee, the second Patrick Troughton, the first William Hartnell. Then it keeps going. We see 8 more faces, and the question, it's never explicitly stated who these faces are, who these men are, but given that we've been rolling back through Doctors and then we see 8 more faces, it's kind of implied, right, that these are Doctors that come before Hartnell, and Philip Hinchcliffe, who was the producer of Doctor Who at the time, and was actually one of the faces you see on the screen. He said, it's true that I attempted to imply that William Hartnell was not the first Doctor. Apparently the original plan was to get famous actors of the time to agree to have their image used to represent these pre-Hartnell Doctors, but they couldn't get anyone to agree to it, possibly because they thought it would be ruling them out of playing the Doctor
True. At
a future stage. So they used what Hinchcliffe called backroom boys, himself, Robert Holmes, who was the script editor and the co-writer of Brain of Morbius, and several others behind the scenes crew members and creatives. Their faces were used to represent these pre-Hartnell Doctors, these Morbius Doctors.
Yeah, and since then, kind of, I think it's been an interesting one in that in the same year, The Deadly Assassin came out, and basically were like, oh no, the Doctor and all Time Lords have 13 incarnations. Technically, at the time, that didn't rule out the Morbius Doctors because there hadn't been, loads and loads of Doctors at that stage. But retroactively, obviously, there were more Doctors after Tom Baker. So Tom Baker wasn't the 12th Doctor, and so then it kind of was just sort of like, right, I guess we'll just sort of ignore that then. And it's kind of been something that's stuck around with fans for ages, hasn't it? Like, fans have tried to sort of create a reason why it works, like, oh, they're actually Morbius's regenerations was the canon thing for a while, or they've said like, oh, maybe this is potential incarnations the Doctor could have had or something, lots of things like that.
I love that there's that clash though, not only because as you said, Brain of Morbius and Deadly Assassin were aired in separate series but were aired the same year, but also that they're written by the same person. so Brain of Morbius is credited to Robin Bland, but that's a pseudonym, and it was actually co-written by, as I said, Robert Holmes, who was the script editor of Doctor Who, and Terence Dix. And Holmes, who again, he was one of the faces, he was one of the Morbius Doctors. He said at the time, or slightly later, he said, we don't know which one Hartnell was, whether he was the first Doctor or not. In the phantasmagoric scene where they're mind wrestling, we see the Doctor forced back through a number of regenerations. So Holmes was very much on board with the idea that these were previous incarnations of the Doctor, although he also was very much on board on establishing the regeneration limit that was established in The Deadly Assassin.
I mean, I do think it's quite funny that these days we're sort of like, oh, how could, this episode where the Master says Gallifrey's in a bubble universe when it hasn't been in a bubble universe for the last year, how could they get this crucial thing wrong? Oh god, the BBC just doesn't care about Doctor Who anymore. Whereas then, like, literally, like a few months after, they sort of were like, oh, look, all these extra regenerations, who knows what it is? And it's like, no, it's a completely contradictory rule that I've also invented. Shut up.
Yeah, the same writer did it, and this is often held up as like the peak of at least the classic era, right? And continuity was as unimportant then as it is now, gloriously unimportant. But as you say, there have been some some suggestions as to how this could all fit together. That they might be the faces that you see on the screen could be Morbius's incarnations. There's also this idea that I think was introduced in Lungbarrow, which was a novel, a Doctor Who novel, published in the 90s, adapted from an unused idea for the television series. And that, so it doesn't explicitly state, but it implies that that William Hartnell's Doctor was the first, but that those other faces, these Morbius Doctors, were actually the faces of the other, who was some kind of progenitor of the Doctor, and the Doctor is a reincarnation of the other, who was a third figure who formed Time Lord Society alongside Rassilon and Omega. Now we'll get onto this, I'm sure, but the Timeless Children, now that episode, that series 12 episode, has more or less, again, not explicitly stated, but implied that in fact the Morbius Doctors were pre-Hartnell incarnations. But what's interesting, I thought, is that episode, despite kind of going against what Lungbarrow, the novel, suggests, it does also deal in this idea of the other, this third founder of Time Lord Society, with the character of Tecteun.
No, part of me was sort of wondering, I was sort of like, is technically the Doctor the other again then? Because like, if arguably the child that Tecteun finds who becomes the Doctor later on is sort of a founder of Gallifreyan society, and Rassilon and Omega, it says in the scripts for the Timeless Children that it's Rassilon and Omega who are like walking with Tecteun at one point. So like, maybe there's sort of a little bit of crossover there.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So Timeless Children kind of contradicts Lungbarrow, but it also kind of touches on similar themes.
It's definitely interesting. I mean, when we sort of thought this was coming up in January, I spoke to Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, obviously, who are pretty involved with Doctor Who. And basically they said, like, at the time when the Brain of Morbius came out, they were like, oh, that's so exciting. And then Stephen Moffat says, I hated the fact that they said the Doctor could only regenerate 12 times. I had subtracted from me all the joy of imagining those other Doctors by this bloody rule that came in that for some reason we all decided was true, despite the fact that there are many contradictions. Obviously, Stephen Moffat actually used that rule himself as a kind of like big ending point for Matt Smith's Doctor, because he was, as we thought at the time, technically the 13th Doctor because of the War Doctor and David Tennant regenerating as himself, so he could have an extra 2 months like flying around the universe. But yeah, so it's kind of interesting. I do feel like it's interesting that the Timeless Children kind of restored this idea, because I mean, I interviewed Stephen Moffat again after the episode aired for something else, and he said like, well, I knew which way the wind was blowing when I talked to you about that, in terms of I didn't have any inside information, but I'm not an idiot. I kind of knew that's probably where Chris was going to go with it. And it is interesting because obviously what's revealed in the Timeless Children is very specific. It's not even just like the Doctor had lives before Hartnell. It's that the Doctor was possibly not a Time Lord, was just a being from another universe, has this whole other origin, blah, 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 blah. But it does specifically in that bit where she kind of has a sort of mental, another kind of mental battle with the sort of what was it called again? The thing on Gallifrey, the computer.
When she's trapped in when the Master has trapped her in the Matrix.
The Matrix. I can think of what I was thinking. The data slice, but no, that was something else. Yeah, trapped in the Matrix, and then she sort of pushes past with like the classic. Oh, here's a fun sort of shot of all the Doctors that we know and some of their companions. But then also it flashes through the Morbius Doctors, so it's sort of suggesting that there may be part of it, but also it doesn't explicitly say how they fit in, because the Joe Martin Doctor wasn't one of the Morbius Doctors in Brain of Morbius. Obviously that would be ridiculous, but like within canon that doesn't make sense. We've none of the sort of younger Doctors that we saw, they're like, well, not even the Doctors, the Timeless Child versions, none of them were in Brain of Morbius, so it's kind of a bit ambiguous as to what like the Morbius Doctors are, where they fit in. Are they pre or post Joe Martin, assuming that they are still proper incarnations of a Doctor and not some sort of alternate thing like we said before.
Yeah, well, we're taking, we're assuming that Timeless Children confirms that the Morbius Doctors are previous incarnations of the Doctor, because that episode establishes that there were some other pre-Hartnell incarnations, and because we see those faces of the Morbius Doctors during the Doctor's sort of psychic shock, that sort of brainwave that releases it from the Matrix. We see those faces, but again, it's not explicitly stated who they are, or that they are previous incarnations of the Doctor. There's not a scene where the 13th Doctor, where the Jodie's Doctor says, "Oh yeah, I was that guy with the hat, and I was that guy with the mustache."
Oh god, I remember my mustache now.
There's still, as I think there always should be with Doctor Who, there's still like a little bit of wiggle room.
Definitely. I think it's
to theorize around.
Yeah, exactly. I do feel like as well, like all that episode really confirms is that the Morbius Doctors matter. Do you know what I mean? That they are of some significance still. And it is kind of a funny thing to kind of have pulled out in like the new series. You know, when we were complaining, and we've said this before, but when we were complaining in series 11 about, there's no returning monsters. You know, it's very standalone. It's for a new series. And then in series 12, it's like, hey, remember that plot hole from 1976 that no one knows about? Well, it's really important now, apparently.
Yeah. No, I don't think when any of us were watching Series 11, we would have predicted that Series 12 would end with the return of the Master, sort of the Cybermen invading Gallifrey, becoming some sort of Cyberman Time Lord fusion. Oh, and also there's a direct reference to the brain of Morbius.
Yeah, but there's footage played from the brain of Morbius during the episode.
Yeah. Never underestimate Doctor Who. But what's interesting as well in terms of how the Morbius Doctors might fit into the Doctor's personal timeline is the montage that you see of those faces in The Timeless Children is actually a different order to the order in which the faces appear in the brain of Morbius. So you're sort of assuming that because it goes fourth Doctor, third Doctor, second Doctor, first Doctor, then these faces, you kind of assume that it's winding back through the Doctor's personal timeline. But then Timeless Children presents a different order where you see the Timeless Children, the sort of the younger versions of the being that would become the Doctor. You then see Philip Hinchcliffe. You then see Christopher Baker, Robert Banks Stewart, George Galaccio, Robert Holmes, Graham Harper, and Douglas Camfield, who are all the Morbius Doctors. Then you see Brendan. Let's not forget Brendan. And then you see Joe Martin. So it implies that in between the Timeless Children and Joe Martin, that's where the Morbius Doctors fit, and that Joe Martin is potentially the final pre-Hartnell incarnation. But then that sort of goes against it both confirms what the brain of Morbius was suggesting, but also kind of contradicts it again in the sense that it's not the same order as we saw in the brain of Morbius. So
that's really interesting. I didn't even thought about the significance of them, appearing in that vision. I sort of assumed they were in the same order as they'd been in Brain of Morbius. I didn't go and check, Morgan. I didn't do my due diligence.
Do you know what? I didn't spot it first time round. All credit as ever to the TARDIS Wikia, where someone has actually noticed that they were in a different order in Timeless Children than they were in Brain of Morbius.
Of course, that could just be aesthetics. It could have been, but it looked better in some way. But they all look kind of similar. So, you sort of feel like it's just a sort of slightly coloured image, isn't it? So
I like the idea that it was just a purely sort of aesthetic choice, and by reordering those Morbius Doctors, the person who did it has no idea what chaos they have created among fandom.
Maybe they do, and they just did it for fun, just to mess with people. They were just like, I'm going to move the fifth one over here. See what they think about that.
We will include the Morbius Doctors, but then we'll mix them around a bit just to mess with you.
Yeah, and we'll just add a little mole onto the left cheek of one of them and see what people think about that. One of them has a new mustache. No, that's really interesting. I mean, I hadn't also quite clocked the idea that it was but it showed the Timeless Children and Brendan and stuff, because the sort of, I guess not to go too deep into Timeless Children again, but I guess the sort of thrust of that story was, Brendan was sort of a kind of, I don't know, sort of like a fake. I keep on saying skin. I mean skin in terms of like a video game thing where you can change the look of your character in the world. But it's like a kind of a mod maybe. Brendan was like a mod on the Doctor's memories where it was sort of about being found by Tecteon and first regenerating, but it was also sort of about joining the Gallifreyan secret police and having the memory wiped. And I'm sort of like, the Joe Martin Doctor, if she came after Brendan, then that she still remembered stuff. So maybe that doesn't quite work, in terms of thing, unless that maybe that happened more than once. I don't know.
And the fact that Brendan appears in that vision of the Doctors, Brendan was not the Doctor. Brendan, as you say, Brendan was this kind of this guise that the Doctor's buried memories had taken within the Matrix.
Brendan is the other.
So the fact that the Doctor saw Brendan Brendan is not a valid incarnation of the Doctor, which is not a sentence I ever thought I'd be using.
I'm sure the
a
actor
few
would disagree with you when it comes to booking Comic-Con appearances.
He's one of those quasi Doctors that we talked about previously, like the Watcher from Legopolis.
On our spectrum of Doctors.
Yeah, exactly. So having Brendan within that vision doesn't confirm him as a face of the Doctor. So just because the Morbius Doctors are in there, it still doesn't 100% confirm that those were sort of bona fide incarnations, if you like. It could have been that they are some representation of something else within the Matrix, or who knows. Again, there's definite sort of wiggle room and room to theorize.
Definitely. I mean, the thing that strikes me, and I know I kind of already made this point, slightly as a joke, was that the fact that Chris Chibnall and the Doctor Who team chose to include them in that vision, it is kind of, maybe they're not going to really lay it out and be like, oh yeah, the Philip Hinchcliffe Doctor, here's his adventures, Big Finish calling up. Obligatory mention of Big Finish there. But I think it's maybe more to do with the fact that it's maybe a nod for fans that like there is a way that this will fit in. It's possible they won't want to explain in depth exactly what happened in the Doctor's missing years, because that's maybe the point of a lot of what happened in the Timeless Children, is adding that mystery again, because a lot of the Doctor's past has been filled in over the years. And one of the sort of, I mean, people have obviously had a lot of criticisms of the Timeless Children, but one of the things that you can take as a positive from it is that there are some mysteries about the Doctor's past again. Also the Doctor doesn't know them is the only thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's it. I think I said it at the time, but whether you're a fan or not of what happened in the Timeless Children, of those developments, it absolutely restored some sense of mystery to the character of the Doctor, in the sense of for the first time since 1969, the Doctor's origins are a mystery. Exactly, who or what the Doctor is has become a mystery again.
Definitely,
it's interesting you mention a Big Finish there, because the Morbius Doctors is interesting in the sense of, as you say, they're probably, it's having them appear in the Timeless Children is just a fun nod, basically, isn't it? They're not going to dive back into explaining the Doctor's past lives, or at least not that period, in all likelihood. But the Morbius Doctors sort of remains one of the unexplored. One of the great unexplored mysteries of Doctor Who, in that most sort of unresolved plot holes or inconsistencies or things that were left up in the air have at some point been addressed and explored in spin-off media. Because there's been so much Doctor Who spin-off media, comics and books and audios, that pretty much everything that even got like a passing reference, things like the terrible Zodin and Medusa Cascade, they've all been sort of like writ large and explored in spin-off media. But the Morbius Doctor is not really, which is fascinating when you think it, because it's such an idea so sort of ripe with potential. I don't know if there's some sort of like ruling around non-BBC sanctioned doctors or something, but you would think that they would have appeared, these characters, these incarnations at some point, but not really. So the only reference, I think, is there's a novel, again a novel from the Virgin New Adventures line, Cold Fusion, or it's a sort of Missing Adventures, New Adventures crossover, and it features a Time Lord character who is said to have married Omega's widow, Patience, and Lance Parkin, the author, he said that this character who married Omega's widow is intended to be one of the Morbius Doctors. Is intended to be the Douglas Camfield Doctor.
Specifically.
If you're taking notes.
Douglas Camfield is the Doctor.
And that's the Doctor that's supposed to have been around at the time of Susan's birth. But even that is only sort of implied, and that's not even directly addressed in the book. That's just something that Lance Parkin has said, in interviews and that kind of thing. Oh yeah, I totally meant that to be the Douglas Camfield Doctor. But even there, it's not directly addressed. And the Morbius Doctors have never. Obviously, you couldn't really do a Big Finish range with Philip Hinchcliffe playing his Doctor, although maybe.
Maybe now.
But there's potential, obviously, to explore those characters in books and short stories and comic strips. So it's odd, really, that they haven't.
Definitely. I mean, it's one of the things I kind of agreed with Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss about when I talked to them, was in terms of like, I was a bit of a name drop there, it wasn't meant to be. Did
you speak to Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss? Yeah.
I'm not sure if I've mentioned. Came up, just having a chat, just three lads having a natter. No, but genuinely, I did kind of like the point they made, which was you know, when it suddenly throws out, oh yeah, here's these 8 other doctors, it's like, what? Whoa, that's crazy. And then when they're like, no, actually the world is smaller than this, it is just what you've seen on screen. I've always disliked the whole, just what you've seen on screen is the truth of Doctor Who. Like, I understand why it happened, but I do think, like, from a storytelling perspective, it is daft to start with the first Doctor. If you have this centuries old, you know, face changing Time Lord who has a mysterious past, how come all that past happened in this one life, and then much less of his life happened since he started changing his face? He got addicted to it. You know, he had like 900 years or however many 100 years as the first Doctor. I mean, he's just like zap, 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 zap every couple of years, just changing face again. Like, he's gone mad.
Just lived a very sort of quaint life for 400 years, and then left Gallifrey, and it all just went to pot. And suddenly he's running into, you know, danger here, there, and everywhere, regenerating all over the place.
Exactly, yeah. And I do kind of like the idea that, like, I know retrospectively they've kind of sort of said, oh look, the first Doctor's so young, you know, like the Doctor would sort of say that of himself, you know, when you're sort of trying to be all important like you do when you're young. I always thought that was quite clever. But yeah, from a storytelling perspective, I did always think it felt silly for us to have seen all of it. I know it sounds odd, but you know what I mean? Like, it's rare that when you meet a sort of old and mysterious character, it feels wrong to kind of feel like we should have seen all of his life or her life.
It robs the character of some mystery, and I think both the revelations in the Timeless Children, again, whether you like them or not, and this idea of the Morbius Doctors back from 1976, both of them lend the character of the Doctor a new sense of mystery, and a sense of the unexplored, and that we don't know everything. And that's exciting, because if you know everything, there's nowhere to go. I think that it's, as you say, it's exciting that we don't know everything, that we leave some things open. As ever, gives us something to talk about.
It does. I mean, we've talked about the Timeless Children more than once on this podcast, like several times we've brought it up. We did a thing about the Doctor's extra lives. We did it about, you know, we did the episode itself. Now we're doing this. We're just milking it for all it's worth.
But I love it. That's why it's great that there are these unresolved plot lines and these ambiguities and these things that are left open to interpretation in Doctor Who. Because I think genuinely, like, a huge part of being a Doctor Who fan is getting to have your certainly your opinions, but definitely as well, like your theories as to what this means and what that reference might mean, and you know, is there scope for adventures beyond what we see on TV? That's part of the fun. So to limit that, I think is a shame, and that's why I love the Morbius Doctors.
Very nice. I mean, going forward, do you think we're going to have that resolved? Do you think Series 13? You know, I know we said we can't imagine them really saying, "Oh, here's Philip Hinchcliffe, Doctor," you know, off having adventures. But you know what? I wouldn't have thought we were going to get John Barrowman back as Captain Jack, and then jump into a storyline about, you know, the Morbius Doctors. So it's hard to say what they'll do and what they won't do, I think.
I think an on-screen appearance from Philip Hinchcliffe might be pushing it even, you know, I always said don't underestimate Doctor Who, but maybe that's a little too far.
You have to CG him to make him the right age, I suppose.
That would be great. Yeah, go like full Irishman on it.
Directed by Martin Scorsese.
but you know, who knows? I certainly wouldn't rule it out in terms of, could the Morbius Doctors be addressed? Could you use that archive footage again? Could you flash back to the brain of Morbius and there be some kind of explanation given as to who exactly they are? That might be fun, because even if you were to firm up exactly who the Morbius Doctors were, if you were to definitively state that they were previous incarnations of the Doctor, that doesn't go against what I was saying before. There's still plenty of ambiguity now in the Doctor's past. We don't know. You know, we know about the Timeless Children, those younger incarnations. We know about Jo Martin, but we don't know exactly where she falls. We know about the Morbius Doctors, but we don't know exactly who they are or where they fall. And then there's still potentially way more incarnations that we've never even seen or glimpsed. So I think you could go some way to kind of delving into the Morbius Doctors without totally spoiling the mystery that surrounds the Doctor's past.
Yeah, because that's sort of the point of this, right, is to kind of restore a bit of that mystery. So you think they wouldn't then be like, okay, so this happened then, and then this guy came to him along, and you regenerate into this guy. You know, I mean, on the flip side, I was thinking about that bit in, I think it's in The Witch is Familiar, where they kind of flash back to some previous Doctors, and Missy's sort of like, oh, I always see him the same, so, you know, picture him however you want. And because you kind of see him as William Hartnell and as Tom Baker in sort of silhouette, like running from pillar to pillar in the darkness, and then he runs to the next pillar and he's Peter Capaldi. It's kind of a nice little effect. But I do wonder if there could be something like that, or like things they did in The Name of the Doctor and, you know, in The Day of the Doctor towards the end, where you kind of have stand-ins, and because obviously the Morbius Doctors have only been in kind of slightly grainy images from, you know, in a slight green filter, you could arguably cast someone new as one of these Morbius Doctors and have them have a bigger role if you wanted to. Like, I'm not saying they necessarily would, but like, I don't think anyone would be like, oh, I can't believe you've done Philip Hinchcliffe so dirty, you know, replaced him like that. You know, I don't think even he would be particularly annoyed by that. You could find someone who looked a bit like him or enough like the photo. Do you know what I mean?
No, potentially. I just like the idea that in that final sort of lineup of Doctors in the Day of the Doctor, that the Morbius Doctors were sort of just you know, just out of shot.
You pan out further, and then there's like Richard E. Grant and Joe Martin and all the Morbius Doctors, and then there's like, you know, various alternate ones from other Big Finish stories.
Yeah,
and
David Warner, Rowan Atkinson, they're all there.
Rowan Atkinson, yeah, Hugh Grant. Who was I thinking of? Oh, and guy from Star Wars. I've forgotten his name. That's really bad. The incredibly Peter Cushing. I couldn't think of Peter Cushing's name.
The guy from Star Wars.
It's really embarrassing. I can't believe I've done that on air, as it were. I know who Peter Cushing is. I talk about Peter Cushing a lot. It's actually more of an issue than anything. Anyway, like, I think, you know, already when you kind of look at the Day of the Doctor, you're a bit like, but they're missing loads of them, and now, you know, they're going to maybe have even more. But yeah, no, I think, you know, going forward, I'm quite interested to see what they do with this Morbius Doctor storyline. It's fun to have an old part of the classic series be such a going concern. I feel like that's not really something we've had beyond like monsters coming back and stuff. It's unusual for kind of like a story point from the classic series to be an important story point in the modern series, isn't it? It's not something we've seen that often.
No. Yeah, you have the kinds of the central tenets of Doctor Who that will keep recurring, that, like you say, returning monsters and things like Gallifrey. But in terms of directly addressing a plot point from 1976, it's fairly unique. But we know Chris Chibnall's a Doctor Who fan. We know he knows his lore.
Yeah.
He might go out of his way to rewrite the lore, but he can only do that because he knows it so well.
Yeah.
So it's a unique situation, and I'm intrigued to see how it develops, if indeed it does develop.
But what do you think, our loyal listeners? Do you think that the Morbius Doctor storyline will be solved in the next series? Do you have a theory about how it all fits in and how they all order up? Is someone going to start going on about the gap between Patrick Troughton and John Pertwee and was it Series 6B? You know, I mean, the questions we have could be endless. I mean, yeah, please let us know in the comments any of your thoughts or theories about the Morbius Doctors. If you want to read more about the Morbius Doctors, our very own Morgan Jeffrey wrote a lot about them during the time of Series 12, and that's all on radiotimes.com. Maybe I'll put a link in the description. Maybe I'll forget. Who knows? And there's obviously loads more Doctor Who content on radiotimes.com, as I say every week. Loads of fun features and news stories and interviews and whatnot. And yeah, you can also check out our previous podcast. Last week, we talked about Doctor Who being cancelled in the 1980s. And we've also previously talked about these missing doctors in another one of our episodes from a few weeks ago. So you can get a different side. Maybe we'll have swapped opinions because, you know, just to make it up. I can't remember what we said in that one.
We're nothing if not inconsistent.
Exactly. In many ways, like Doctor Who canon. You know,
there you go. Perfect.
It all ties together. Anyway, thanks for listening. I've been Huw Fullerton.
I've been Morgan Jeffrey.
And goodbye.